So I'm gonna spend some time. I'm gonna show my age a little bit here. I know a lot of people have said that I'm still technically a young person, and I know that I'm 30 years old. And yes, I like that title that I'm still a young person, even though I'm 30. But growing up, I lived in an age where we had these unique stores that you were able to go to and rent DVDs, rent VHSs. One of these famous stores was known as Blockbuster. Now, my family, we mostly went to Family Video, but it's the same thing. So, but Blockbuster, it was a library with all these different movies, VHSs and DVDs. And yes, I do remember the age where we still had VHSs. So if you watched a movie, you had the responsibility of rewinding it. But with Blockbuster, it was this library of different movies where you can go there and you can rent a movie, kind of like a book at the library, where you have a week to read the book. At a normal library with Blockbuster, you might have a week, and you watch the movie, and then you have to return it at the end of the week. Otherwise, you have various late fees. Or sometimes if a movie just came out on DVD, you might only be able to get it for one night. And then that might cost like $20, but still you want to rent that movie because you've been waiting for it for so long. And then eventually there was this new company that came around called Netflix. Now, Netflix originally it started as a DVD mailing service where you can order a DVD and it would be mailed to your house. You can watch the film, and then you just put it back in the envelope and mail it back to Netflix. So it pretty much took Blockbuster, the store, out of the equation. You can do the entire process in the comfort of your own home. Well, Blockbuster heard about this and they just said, that's not going to work. Netflix doesn't know what they're doing. We'll be just fine. Well, Netflix went from the mailing service to now a streaming service, which it's now the most popular streaming service out there in the entire internet. It's the number one streaming service. Everyone always says you gotta have Netflix, which then that put Blockbuster pretty much out of business. They knew that this was going to come. They knew that this was going to be popular, but they just refused to accept that it was actually going to work. And so now all the different um, TV rental services, all the DVD rental places, they're pretty much all gone. Well, almost all gone. There's still technically one more Blockbuster store in the United States. It's over in Oregon right now. So if anyone want to do a road trip and just go visit there, want to rent a movie, maybe we can do that. But otherwise, it's all streaming now. And today we're actually going to be looking at the downfall, not of a company, but we're looking at the downfall of a king. But it's not the downfall in terms of a physical kingdom, but more of the person himself. We're continuing our series in the book of Daniel. As we're moving along in this series, I want to make sure that everyone knows like these events are not happening like all like in a row here. They're not happening within the span of a couple of years here. This from chapters 1 through 6, this is roughly about a 70-year time span. So this is not just like, oh, this event happened a couple of days later than this event. So it's over the course of about 70 years. And the time frame between chapters 3 and 4, which 4 we're going to be looking at today, scholars would say this is anywhere between 20 to 30 years of a difference here. So from the fiery furnace, as we took a look at last week, we're now coming to chapter 4, so about 20 to 30 years later. Now, what's very unique about this one particular chapter is that this chapter was not written by Daniel. Even though Daniel was the main author of this book, this particular chapter was not written by Daniel. It was written by King Nebuchadnezzar. So what's so unique is that a pagan king, a letter written by a pagan king, is in scripture. But this particular letter, it was Daniel put it in there to show, to represent on the power of God, to represent how King Nebuchadnezzar, he was telling the kingdom of Babylon, he was telling his people how prideful he was. He was telling them, hey, I was wrong, but God is right. He is mighty, he is powerful. And so we're going to be looking at this unique letter today from King Nebuchadnezzar to his people. So starting off in our first section here, the first 3 verses, we have acknowledgement from the king, which says, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His domain endures from generation to generation. So with this section here, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's just starting off this letter. So what we're going to be looking at today, all of those events have already happened when he started this letter, this opening. He's saying, like, guys, I'm going to tell you what has happened to me. I'm going to tell you about the God that Daniel worships, this miraculous God, his miraculous signs and wonders. I'm going to tell you about him today. And so continuing on, we see in this next section another vision from the king. So that the first section, again, that was acknowledgement from the king. So that's just like his starting point. That was his original intro to this letter, acknowledgement from the king. And now we're looking at another vision from the king. So looking at starting in verse 4, it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in the palace, content and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. I was lying in my bed. The images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret my dream. So the king had another dream. Yes, another dream. So he just seems to have a lot of these unique dreams here. Now, what's different about this dream here is that, well, in chapter 2, that dream where he had like the big statue and everything, if you remember that one, and there was different metals to represent different parts of the body, that dream confused Nebuchadnezzar. He was confused and just wondering, what does this mean? But here in chapter 4, this dream terrified the king. He was scared. He was trying to figure out what is going on here. And it sounds like he only had this dream once when he was trying to figure out, what does this mean? What is going on here? He didn't have it numerous times like the dream in the past, like the dream in chapter 2. Here, he only had it once and said, like, what's going on here? I need my wise men. And what's so unique is that he called his wise men even though they failed the last time. If you remember in chapter 2, when he called the wise men, they failed to do what the king commanded. And so, but the king still wanted his wise men, still trusted them enough to know what the dream meant. And well, the king decided to make it a little bit easier on them this time. Because in chapter 2, the king said, well, I need you to tell me what my dream was and then interpret the dream. Whereas this time in chapter 4, the king says, well, here's my dream. I'm going to tell you what it actually is. I just want you to tell me the interpretation. So there was a little bit of an easier avenue for the wise men this time. But the wise man could not do it because in verse 8, we see that it says, finally, Daniel came into my presence and I told him the dream. And so he finally did what he probably should have done in the first place, just called Daniel. Daniel, he's the master of all the wise men. He's in charge of all these wise men. But it's interesting that he didn't call Daniel first. Now, you might be wondering, why wasn't Daniel originally with all the other wise men? So, well, number one, most likely with Daniel being the head of all the wise men, the master of all the wise men, most likely he had some responsibilities elsewhere. And so he had to take care of those responsibilities. And then when he was done, it's like, okay, I'm going to go and see the king and what's going on here. Now, also, we understand that in the past, Daniel didn't associate with the wise men very often. He only had to be there when he was required to, because he and his friends, they didn't want to go into like their traditions, their pagan traditions, the worship of their numerous gods. He wanted to focus on the one true God. So he didn't want to be corrupted. And so he stayed focused on his task, on his God. And so then the king then told Daniel the dream, which we see this starting in verse 10. So the dream is this. So starting verse 10, these are the visions I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under the breasts of the field found shelter, or of the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. Verse 13. In the visions I saw while laying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. Verse 14, he called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from the branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass, on the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. Verse 17, the decision in an announcement announced by messengers, the holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to everyone he wishes and sets over them the lowest of men. This is one intense dream, wouldn't you say? I mean, I would be scared too if I saw this. Trying to understand what does this mean? Like, what is this tree? Who is this tree? What is going on? Now, what's so unique about Daniel is that he came to the king. He came to help him out. And we see this starting in verse 19, which is our next section, which is another interpretation from Daniel. So we saw another dream from the king, and now we see another interpretation from Daniel. And so then Daniel, he came to the king and he was loyal to the king. And we see this starting in verse 19. It says, Then Daniel, also called Belshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. So Daniel was loyal to King Nebuchadnezzar. Don't you find that very fascinating, very, very interesting? Even though the king worshiped numerous gods, took Daniel's land, destroyed his home, Daniel was loyal to the king, to the very man that gave the order to destroy Daniel's home. Daniel said, I am loyal to the king. How fascinating is that? Daniel was loyal to the king. He stayed true to the king. And with this dream, he even said, Daniel said, I wish this meant for your enemies. I wish that this dream was for your enemies and not for you. And Daniel then gives the interpretation starting in verse 20. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible in the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. Verse 22. You, O king, are the tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your domain extends to the distant parts of the earth. Verse 23, you, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from the heaven, and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze. In the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like the wild animals until 7 times have passed. This interpretation, O king, and it's the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from the peoples and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. You'll be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until acknowledgement that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Verse 27, therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. So Daniel is telling the king that, hey, like this tree, the tree in your dream, the one that's going to be cut down, that's you, king. That's you, King Nebuchadnezzar. And you're going to get the mind of a wild animal. And you will be like that for 7 times. Now with that, the mind of an animal. For us humans, we were created above animals. In fact, I want you to remember back during the time of Genesis, when we were looking at the time of creation, this was earlier in the year, how God made humans to rule over the animals of the world. We were created different than animals. God didn't make us like the animals because he gave us something unique. He gave us a unique mind. He gave us the free will. And so for a human to have the mind of an animal, we are then less human. We become subhuman. But more than that, it's a king, a ruler of what's considered to be the greatest nation of the time to then get the mind of an animal, to eat grass, to live among the animals in the fields. And the only time that he will stop being like that, the only time that the king will stop having the mind of a beast is when he acknowledges that God is the true king. But before that time, before King Nebuchadnezzar would acknowledge that, Daniel said that he's going to have to go through the mind of a beast. He's going to have to endure that 7 times. Now, I'm not talking about 7 separate times that he'll have the mind of a beast. Now, that time frame, we understand 7 times, it is a particular time frame, but what is that official time frame? We're not 100% sure. Some people have said, well, 7 times, that means 7 years. Other people say, well, it's more like 7 months. Other people have said, well, it's like 7 seasons. But no matter what the case, having the mind of a beast is not good. He's going to have to endure this suffering, endure this hardship for quite some time. He's going to have to endure this punishment for a long time. And so Daniel gave him this warning of what was to come, of what would happen. Then as we get to our fourth and final section, we see the dream coming true. This is our final section, starting in verse 28, how the dream comes true. All this happened to the king Nebuchadnezzar, verse 29, 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he heard the interpretation of the dream from Daniel. 12 months later, that's where we're all right now. So 1 year later, we'll pick this back up in verse 30. He said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal resistance by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? So King Nebuchadnezzar, he was boasting about his greatness, about his power, how great his kingdom was, and how he was able to get to that point, how he made this kingdom. And you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if he even considered himself to be God. In fact, we even seen various kingdoms would consider their king as a deity. Some people would say like the king is God. In fact, in Egypt, they considered Pharaoh to be a god. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Nebuchadnezzar, with all that pride that was within him, if he considered himself to be a god or the God. But then in verse 31, we see the dream coming true. It says, the words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what the decree for you. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You'll be driven away from people and live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. and gives them to anyone he wishes. Verse 33, immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Wow. He pretty much lost it. He lost it completely. He was no longer a human. Now, sure, he was human in terms of his body, but his mind was gone. God was still in control. God was in control here with his mind. He was driven away from people, ate grass like cattle, his body drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of eagles, and his nails grew like the claws of a bird. So not only was it the mind of an animal, but he had the diet of an animal, and he was just gone. He was not acting like what a human would act. You see, Nebuchadnezzar, he knew about the one true God. He knew about Jehovah. He knew about Yahweh, but he never fully acknowledged that he is God. He knew about his power. He knew about his greatness. He saw it before. He saw it with Daniel interpreting all the dreams. He saw it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we saw last week, saving them from the fiery furnace, but he never gave 100% to God. He was still filled with pride, and well, look where his pride got him. But then in verse 34, it says, at the end of that time, so this is the seven times. Again, we don't know if it's 7 years, 7 months, 7 seasons, but we know it's a great long time frame. This is longer than just a 5-minute timeout that you might give a 6-year-old. This is a very long time frame. So again, at verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my eyes sank slightly, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His domain is an eternal domain. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Verse 36, at the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and slander were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he has done, or everything he does, is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So Nebuchadnezzar, he realized that there was one way out of his issue, a one way out of getting rid of this mind of a wild animal. And that was to look to heaven and to praise God, to exalt God. And so he did. And we saw that his sanity was restored. That was his one and only way out. God extended grace to King Nebuchadnezzar. He extended this free gift, a free gift that we don't deserve. And from this time, King Nebuchadnezzar realized that God is the one true God. He exalted him, praised him. And what's so unique is that during this time is that King Nebuchadnezzar, his kingdom, Babylon, did not fall to another kingdom. Don't you think how great and mighty our God is? Not only did he control this entire circumstance, but while King Nebuchadnezzar was in this state of a wild animal, Babylon was not taken over by anyone else. I want you to think about this. If you were a rival kingdom and you saw the king was vulnerable, are you going to just sit there and be like, okay, I'm just going to leave Babylon alone, let them deal with their stuff? Or are you going to attack and take over? I would attack personally. I would want to take over the strong Babylon. If you have a chance to take the biggest kingdom down, you better take it. But there was no kingdom that took over Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar was put back on the throne as the king of Babylon. No other kingdom was reigning during that time. There was no other king, but it was just King Nebuchadnezzar. His kingdom was restored to him, and we see that he became a better king. He was better than what he was before. We even see this at the end of verse 36. I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. That's the power of God. Now, what do we see during this time? What is our application? The first one is that we should not test God. We can't test God. See, we can't be like in chapter 3 where it's like we're gonna create this big fiery furnace and then throw 3 people into it and say, okay, God, save them. We can't test them. Nebuchadnezzar, in a way, he tested God. Even though it was a year after he heard about the dream, he still tested God by saying, like, hey, I am the greatest. I'm the most powerful in all the land. And what happened while he was still speaking those words? He became like a wild animal. God warned him through this dream that he had, but King Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't fully believe that it was going to happen. And so he still tested God. We cannot test God. The second thing is leave your pride at the door. See, Nebuchadnezzar, he was very prideful. He was very proud of himself, of the great kingdom that he had made. Because he is the one that's powerful. He is the best in all the land. But when it comes to following God, when it comes to following Jesus, we gotta just leave our pride at the door. We cannot be proud of ourselves. We cannot have pride in ourselves and follow Christ. It doesn't work both ways. We can't live for ourselves and live for Christ. It doesn't work. We can either live for ourselves or live for Christ. Which goes into our third and final application, which is you cannot be partly a believer in Jesus. You got to be 100% fully committed to Christ. And we saw this with Nebuchadnezzar, where he was, I would say he would consider himself to be a lukewarm Christian. He's not a Christian, but he's not a hardcore Christian, like, or a believer in God. It's not that he doesn't believe in God, but he's not fully committed to God. He's somewhere in the middle. Has anyone else ever heard that? Where it's like people have said, well, I'm not 100% believer in God, but like I'm partially a believer in God. It's like, for me, I'm thinking, well, would you have lukewarm coffee? Would you ever drink lukewarm coffee? Did you wake up in the morning and be like, I want some lukewarm coffee? For me, I don't like lukewarm coffee. I prefer hot coffee. Once in a while, I might want iced coffee. But in either case, it's either hot or cold. You can't be in the middle. You can't be partially one way or partially the other. It's either you're in or you're out. You can't have just like one foot in the door. You're either in or you're out. That's how it works. 100% in, 100% committed to following Christ or not. That's how it works. And Nebuchadnezzar, I would say he would consider himself to be a partial believer. But then he learned that there's no partial believers. You're either 100% in or not. And friends, I pray that we do take these lessons to our hearts, that we understand that we cannot live for ourselves, that we cannot have pride of ourselves, but we have to live for Christ. Let us pray.